We arrived in Puno in the early afternoon, checked straight into Inca's Rest Hotel, which I forgot to film, and then headed out for a walk where we came across some peddlers, so obviously we had to hire them and paid a grand total of £1. Sue was duty drives and did a fine job at steering us round the lake. We classed this activity as part of the acclimatisation process because the city of Puno is sat at 3,827 metres above sea level, which is the highest city we'd be visiting in Peru. But we knew we had a couple of hikes coming up, so we wanted to be well acclimatised. After an hour of sailing around Lake Titicaca, we headed back to land. Around the dock there was this lighthouse and this massive Lago Titicaca sign. And then they had a huge walkway over a bridge through the lake, so we followed that back into town, passing lots of stray guinea pigs on the way. Then we heard some noise coming from the university stadium, so we walked over to check it out. But it turns out it was just a group of kids practicing a dance to a very enthusiastic dance teacher with a whistle. Then we walked back towards the accommodation, where we had to fight through crowds of people, because there was a massive parade going on to celebrate 200 years of the local university.
At 35:46 the next day, we headed down to the docks ready to catch our boat for our stay over on Lake Titicaca, which started with a serenade of our favourite song. Our first stop was the Aguas floating islands. The islanders have lived here since the 15th century and was originally a way of escaping the Inca Empire's control, as they couldn't navigate the water. It soon became a way of life for them. The lake has massive sections of totora reeds, and the root layer of these reeds is incredibly buoyant. We were given a demonstration of how the islands were produced. First they'd gather these massive sections of the weed roots, strap multiple ones together, then lay them in the water. On top of this they'd cross layer upon layer of reeds, which was a process that would continue for the entire life of the island. Once it was completed, it looked something like this, and there were hundreds of these islands in the community of Aguas. We were then given a reed each, which turned out to double as a tasty snack. And by tasty snack, I mean it had the texture of celery and the taste of a very weak cucumber. But we all politely ate it, hoping it wouldn't destroy our digestive systems. We then took a tour of some of the islanders' houses, which were all fully set up with solar panels. Then it was time to take a journey on one of the reed boats. Hulls of these boats are made purely of bundled reeds, and had animal shapes to the front end which the locals believed gave them protection on the water. Before we left, we were given a goodbye song from the islanders. Then it was out into the water, where we quickly realised their rowing technique left a lot to be desired. After we'd span round in circles for about 15 minutes, another local came along with an outboard motor, and we were en route to the next island, where we chilled out for a coffee, before reboarding our motorboat and heading deeper into the lake, where, as you can see, they weren't short a reed or two. Especially this guy. After a boat journey of about 2 hours, we arrived at the island of Amantani, where we were met by our host Juan Carlos and started a surprisingly difficult walk to his house, since it sat about 3,900 metres above sea level. The views of the lake from his terrace were absolutely stunning, as was the lunch he cooked us of local cheese, locally grown potatoes. As usual, we planned to be on the island for their yearly festival. We didn't. Where locals from the 10 districts of the small island came together to perform traditional dance routines, some of which were slightly stranger than the others. After the day celebrations were over, it was time to climb the hill to the very top of Amantani, where there were 2 Inca shrines, one to Pachamama, one to Pachitata, or Mother and Father Earth. On our journey, we'd each carry 3 coca leaves as an offering, and once we received them, we set off on our quest. Although not a long route, it was very, very steep, hitting a peak altitude of 4,150 metres above sea level. So we took it nice and slow, taking in the amazing sights of the island. Eventually we made it to the top, just in time for the sun to start setting, and with these stunning views of Lake Titicaca. We walked 3 laps of the shrine, then laid our offerings at the gate. We were unable to go into the grounds of the shrine itself. They are only open 1 day a year, on the 3rd Thursday of January. After getting our breath back at the top, we took in the sunset, and followed the path back down into the town centre again, which was much easier than the way up. And far in the distance we could see the Andes Mountains of Bolivia. Back in town, it was time for a celebratory drink. at which point we were just in time to see the next stage of the island's celebrations. Each of the 10 regions of the island bring their own statue made of hay. The islanders would then dance around the statues, whilst one person set it on fire. Boy, did they catch light quickly. The dancing would continue until the statue collapsed and there was just a heap on the floor, at which point a new one would be brought out and it would start all over again. After dinner, our host Juan surprised us with some traditional Peruvian outfits, and without hesitation we put them on with the help of our host family. We took a walk up to the island's community centre, grabbed a beer, and then it was time for the music. The band started to play. Within seconds we were invited up by the locals to take part in what can only be described as the Peruvian Okie Kokie. The dances were relentless. We barely got time for a break in the first hour, but everyone had a great time swinging their Peruvian outfits around. After we'd all absolutely slayed it on the dance floor, we were all absolutely exhausted. We decided to call it a night.
The next morning we were up early to help Juan Carlos, so we had about a 10-minute walk to his parents' house, featuring the dismantling of a dry stone wall. And then for about an hour and a half we helped him harvest some crops in the field. These crops were for faba beans, which were very similar to broad beans. So stem by stem we'd take the pods off and throw them into the middle, and then he'd bag them up ready to take back to his mum's house and to his own house. And that was a job well done for that little field. On the way back to Juan Carlos's house, Jack was bird spotting while I was just admiring the views. And after a short walk back, it was then time for the shelling. So we'd take each bean out of its pod and put them in a pile in the middle. And then just as we thought we were getting done, she brought out another massive bag of pods. Marisol also roasted some for us, so we got to taste them, and they tasted a lot like peanuts. And this activity was a great way to see how the people live sustainably off the land without wanting for much. At 1 o'clock it was time to head back to the dock and get back on the boat, ready to sail to our next spot, which would be Lanchon, a peninsula jutting out into Lake Titicaca. For lunch there was fresh trout from the lake, and then we had lessons in how they make shampoo from local flowers, and how they make chuño, which is basically freeze-drying potatoes. And as you can see, because the chat was potato-based, I was absolutely enthralled. We then had a chance to take some more pictures, before heading back to the boat, and sailing for about an hour to get back to Puno, where we hopped across the boats to get off, and then walked back to the accommodation. That evening I stayed in sorting these videos out, while the others took a short stroll of the city, taking in some of the local sights. The next morning it was time to leave Puno, so we were picked up by the bus and the first stop was this viewpoint, overlooking the city, which weirdly also had massive statues of animals, such as this serpent and this massive puma, with some very realistic features. We could have taken a night bus for this leg, but it ruins your body clock, so we decided to travel to Cusco by day, which all in all took about 12 hours on the bus. But it did make a couple of stops, where we got to stroke very friendly sheep and 2 very friendly dogs. When we got to Cusco we loaded into a minibus, which took us as close as it could to our Airbnb, but it turns out there was still a massive hill we had to go up, and after a good 10 minutes of pure incline, we checked into our Airbnb, which I also forgot to take a video of. The next day the alarms were set for 4 AM, but we'd booked in for separate trips. My mum and Sue were going to hike Palcollo Mountain, while me and Jack were going to do Rainbow Mountain, which is a slightly harder hike. This time we'd actually taken altitude sickness tablets, just to test them out, and they actually seemed to work a treat. Rainbow Mountain is also known as the Mountain of 7 Colours, and it's one of the country's most famous natural attractions. The different colours come from different mineral deposits in the rock and in the soil, including iron oxide, copper and sulphur, all exposed over time by erosion and glacial melt. The hike to the top only took about an hour and a half, but because of the altitude it was a slow walk, and the mountain's summit sits at around 5,200 metres above sea level. When we got to the top it was really touristy and absolutely packed with people. But you could see why, because the views were just insane, and in every direction you looked at from the top it was just stunning. And then as we came back down our guide asked if we wanted to see the Red Valley too, which added a little bit extra onto the hike, but we couldn't say no. This area has more iron oxide deposits, so it's a lot more red in colour than Rainbow Mountain. Then it was time to head back down, guided by a beautiful stray dog. Then that night we chilled in the apartment and watched a film before bed. The following morning we didn't set an alarm, which was bliss. So we chilled until about 9:30, and then headed to the centre for 10 o'clock where we had a walking tour of Cusco. The guide showed us San Francisco Plaza, the Arch of Santa Clara, and then took us to San Pedro Market, where we saw a bunch of local fruit and stalls selling everything you could imagine, including these dried alpaca fetuses, which are apparently used for ritual offerings to Pachamama, which are meant to bring good luck, health and protection. And then at the vegetable stalls they sell this black corn, which makes a fantastic drink called chicha morada. And then there was a whole aisle for potatoes. Did you know potatoes were first discovered in the Andes and then brought to Europe by the Spanish? And in Peru there's over 3,500 different varieties. Then we took a trip down this street where walls built by the Incas were still standing strong and the Spanish had used them as foundations to build upon. After this it was a visit to the palace of Pachacutec, the ruins of an old Inca palace, where they'd also discovered loads of old pots and skeletons. After the tour finished, we went to get some lunch at an authentic Peruvian restaurant, where we each had a litre of chicha morada and a massive meal while watching some traditional dancing. After this we had a meeting to discuss our trip for the next day, and then headed back to the accommodation to pack.
The next morning we were up at 3:30 a.m. and were collected by bus for our 2-hour journey to Ollantaytambo, where we disembarked ready to catch the train, and while we waited we watched the sun rise over the mountains at 5:30 in the morning.
The train itself was very comfortable, but the tracks were a bit old and naff. It did feel a bit like being on a tube train for an hour and a half. But the views we got as we snaked along the side of the Urubamba River through the Sacred Valley were a sight to behold. We left the train at a station called Kilometer 104, and as we crossed the bridge to join the Inca Trail, we were met with the Chichatan Bamba ruins, a spiritual cleansing site for those en route to Machu Picchu. After our first Inca ruins introduction, we set off on our 12-kilometer hike, navigating along the side of the Sacred Valley. We continued to gain in altitude, and the drops at the side of the path got larger and larger, which Beth really enjoyed. Down below you could see the trains running through the valley, en route to Aguas Calientes, which gave you a disconcerting reference to how high we were really getting. We continued along this route for 3 hours, following the paths along the mountainside. As we carried along there were some incredibly steep staircases which slowed the pace. After a while our next stopping point came into view, another Inca ruins in the mountainside, known as Winne Huayna. But before we got there we still had to navigate around the valley, which involved a lot of downhilling and uphilling. And as a stopping point to catch our breath we stopped at this amazing waterfall. After another 20 minutes of walking we finally arrived at Winne Huayna, and the views of the valley were absolutely spectacular. The site was named after the Winne Huayna orchid that grows in the region. It was used as an agricultural site where these terraces were used to grow food that would be sent on to Machu Picchu. Whilst for the Inca travellers, the site contained ritual fountains and accommodation to rest and prepare before their final leg of the journey. To leave the site we had to reach the top of Winne Huayna, which involved what felt like an endless set of staircases, and from there we got some more fantastic views of the valley. We stopped off for a packed lunch provided by the tour company, which turned out to be too big to fit in any of our bags, and then we continued on our way to Machu Picchu. After another hour of walking, we reached the final hurdle, the Monkey Steps, or as they were known to the guides, the Gringo Killers. These steps were really steep, and each one was absolutely massive. So from the bottom, it could look a little daunting, as seen by these concerned looks on my mum's face. But eventually, one by one, we navigated our way up the stairs. And one by one, we successfully made it to the top, where we'd all get a nice long break before carrying on to complete the final section of the journey. Our final climb would take us to Inti Punku, or more famously known as the Sun Gate. Famously, during the winter solstice, the sun passes directly through the gate onto Machu Picchu, and that's where the name comes from. It also acts as a control point for those entering the city. From the top we got magnificent views of the Inca ruins. Stopped for a good 20-minute photo shoot at the top. And we started our downhill trek to a viewing point just above the city, where we saw some of the local gardeners doing a fantastic job of keeping the lawns trimmed. And by gardeners I do mean a big bunch of llamas who were chilling out relaxing on the terraces in the afternoon sun. From the next viewing point we got these insane views of Machu Picchu. And after another long photo shoot with our tour guides, it was time to head down to the town of Aguas Calientes, which meant taking the bus down the winding hills into the valley. The town has no roads leading into it. Access has to be by trains or hiking. It started its life as a railway camp in 1901. Now houses thousands of tourists daily on their way to see the sights. That evening we went for a meal with our tour group, and followed this up with an early night, ready for our next tour in the morning. We were up early the next morning, ready to have a wander around the site of Machu Picchu. But on arrival, the whole site was deep in the clouds. The site was believed to have been constructed in the 1400s, and after the fall of the Inca Empire, wasn't rediscovered until 1911, at which point National Geographic bigged it up It became one of the most important finds of the 20th century. We chilled out on the old agricultural terraces for about an hour and watched as the clouds disappeared, giving way to these beautiful views of the surrounding mountains. Once the sun started shining again, we headed down from the terraces and started our tour. The site contains over 150 buildings, all made of stone and so well made you can't even get a piece of paper between the rocks. The first main building we came to was the Temple of the Sun. This building had 2 windows, through which the sun would directly align during the summer and winter solstices. We then took a wander around the areas where the king and the queen would stay, where they had 2 floors in their house, very snazzy. Then we saw the main plaza, which used to have an important rock in the centre. The King of Spain had it cut down to land his helicopter. We were shown the secret Inca escape routes in case there was an emergency, which are yet to be dug out so no one actually knows where they lead. Then we took a look around this huge shrine shaped like a condor, which was a sacred animal to the Incas. They believed were the messenger of the gods. The skies had completely cleared up by this point, so we took our last looks around the site. Then we jumped on a bus back down to Aguas Calientes. Our first stop that afternoon was the train station. We watched some of the big Peruvian rail trains going in and out, whilst en route crossing this incredibly sophisticated train bridge. Whilst me and the mums were quite interested in watching, Beth didn't seem quite so interested. After we were done with train spotting, we walked up through the town past these statues of Pachamama. Our plan was to go in the town's famous thermal springs, but when we got there they looked a bit gross. Also, I'd been relentlessly bitten by some weird fly, so my left leg was looking a little bit swollen. Instead of the thermal springs, we took a wander up the valley to the famous waterfall. The views of the mountains and trees on the way up was absolutely fantastic. And once we got to the top, we took off our shoes and decided to dip our feet in the water, which, as you can imagine, was relentlessly cold. And Beth got to use her classic line, "Once again, it's quite nice actually." Once we were done freezing our feet off, we started our walk back down the valley into the town of Aguas Calientes. Along the whole route to the waterfalls, tons more carvings, all representing major parts of the Inca civilization. Once we were back in town, we had a bit of food, found somewhere to have a drink, then played the mums in an intense game of chess, where they smashed us because we had no idea what we were doing.
We had a lay-in the next day, where Jack guessed how the mums would be greeting us, and was correct. We didn't have to be at the train station until 2 p.m, so we decided to have a walk along the river and visit the botanical gardens, which had loads of different plants and felt very jungly and peaceful. And here my mum got to show off her horticultural knowledge.
They look like the heads of pink flamingos.
Next up it was Butterfly World, a local conservation initiative aiming to protect and increase the local butterfly population. They focus on around 100 species local to the region, and some of them were absolutely massive. We had a guided tour of the site and they had a lab where you could see each stage of the life cycle. So after a good look around, we went to the cafe for some coffee and cake, which was right on the river, before going back into Aguas Calientes for a 3-course lunch. We then got the train back to Ollantaytambo, where we played some poo head en route, and then got a minibus back to Cusco, where we checked in at Linda's house, where for about £10 a night, it came with a pretty good view over the city. That evening Jack did some uni work, while us gals had a film night. The next day was our last full day in Cusco with the mums, so first up on the to-do list was a trip to Cochahuasi Animal Sanctuary. It's privately ran, and it rescues Andean fauna from illegal trafficking, abandonment and abuse, with a view to rehabilitating them and then releasing them back into the wild, as well as these real-life Paddington bears. They also have a bunch of tortoises, parakeets just wandering around, different types of Amazon parrots, like this blue-fronted parrot, these yellow-crowned parrots, and some macaws that you could feed. They even had a toucan that had been kept in a cage in a restaurant. When they took him in, his beak was really broken, so they made a prosthetic one, but over time his normal beak has grown back. They also have a bunch of condors, which are the massive birds that we saw flying around Colca Canyon, and up close they are just ginormous, almost the same size as Sue. The guide got them to fly from one end to the other, so we could see up close the ridiculous 3-metre wingspan. On the way back to the city centre, our driver stopped off at Awana Cancha, which was a weird combination of an animal sanctuary and a textile and weaving centre. They had tons of alpacas, llamas and vicuñas, and then little stops where you could learn about the weaving and buy some products. Once back in town we had lunch in another Peruvian restaurant, before heading back to San Pedro Market, where we had to try and control the mums on their shopping spree. After this it was back for an early night and a film. It was a pretty chill start the next morning because we didn't have to be out until 10. But it was finally time to say goodbye to the mums. After 3 weeks of non-stop adventure and spending some quality time together, we waved them off to the airport. And as they headed off on their journey, we headed back into Cusco city centre, where, shock horror, there was another parade on. So we battled our way through the crowds with our big bags on, weaving through marching bands and trying not to get trodden on. And then we arrived at another hotel, where I'd booked to keep our big bags for the day. We then found a coffee shop with Wi-Fi, where we stayed until 5 o'clock so Jack could smash out some uni work. And then after a brief catch-up with some friends from Guatemala, we boarded our night bus at 10 p.m, ready for our 14-hour journey from Cusco, passing back through Puno and onto La Paz in Bolivia. I'll save it!